Wednesday's World Economic News. Right, I'll just start with a comment from yesterday's comments on yesterday's World Economic News. When, say, the US government spends an extra, that is, extra deficit of $1 trillion into the economy, that is not taking particularly from the private sector. Taxes have been reduced as part of making up that deficit. Think of it like we do the banks. We as hard-working people that have got money in banks think that when banks lend money, they lend our money. But that's not the better way of thinking about it. To get a good overall picture of how it happens, banks lend money that they make out of nowhere at all, fresh air money. It's always best, I think, to think about governments in the same way. They spend money into the economy from nowhere. So they've spent this extra $1 trillion into the economy, and it rattles through the economy. It gets spent in social security payments, extra unemployment payments, SNAP payments, food stamps. They buy whiz-bangs with it, they pay soldiers with it, they pay teachers with it, directly or indirectly, all that sort of thing. And then all these people go out and spend the money where and when they want on goods and services. It's extra money spent into the economy. That extra money spent into the economy means there is more money in the economy, and there will be more money in the economy to buy bonds, treasuries, whatever it might be, whatever country it might be. And that's the way I would suggest thinking about it. Yeah, okay. Right, World Economic News. Financial Times, Lex on what after QE2, because the big question now is what will happen when QE2 ends in June. Don't look now, but QE2 worked. This is just another, I'm just putting it in to show that everyone is saying QE2 worked, and I find it very odd. The aggressive second round of quantitative easing unleashed last autumn by the Federal Reserve clearly had the advertised effects. Last week's US payroll data underlined this. Last August, when Ben Bernanke of the Fed signaled more bond purchases in a speech at Jackson Hole, the unemployment rate was stuck at 9.6%. Payroll expansion had dipped alarmingly. Now unemployment has ticked down to 8.8%, while on a 6-month rolling average, payrolls are expanding at their fastest since the summer of 2007. This matters to the Fed, whose mandate includes full employment. Now, Lex is one of the bigger hitters in the Financial Times, so I'm just putting this in to show the big hitting financial people think that QE2 worked, or at least that's what they're saying. Moving on. Fitch lowers growth forecast to 8.3%. Mumbai, India. Rating agency Fitch has lowered its global growth forecasts because of high oil prices and the impact of the earthquakes. India's growth outlook for 2011-12 has also been lowered because of high inflation. While India's economy grew 8.7% in full year 11, in line with Fitch's expectation, the agency revised its full year 12 growth forecast down marginally to 8.3 from 8.5 as inflation is easing less quickly than anticipated. Still a bit of an inflation problem in India. Further tightening from the Federal Reserve Bank of India seems likely, leaving an already slowing economy facing an awkward combination of stubbornly high inflation and more headwinds from further policy tightening. The growth forecast for FY13 is unchanged at 8%. This was just to say how important central banks are to economies, and whether they're tightening, putting up interest rate, pulling their trousers up, or dropping their trousers to the floor and flashing to everybody like the Western world has been doing for 2.5 years. Krugman. Is this Krugman yet? No, this isn't Krugman. I forget who this is. But it's a quote, quoting Richard Fisher. As with many policies, there are winners and losers, and the losers now are those dependent on the once steady returns from ultra-safe assets, Dallas Fed President Richard Fisher says. You know, you've got the savers and you've got the borrow and spenders, and the borrow and spenders are winning out on this trousers on the floor policy. Americans who have done everything right, have worked hard, saved their money and stayed out of debt, are the ones being punished by low interest rates. This is Richard Fisher, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. This state of affairs is not sustainable for a long period of time. And it's noted here that Fisher obviously doesn't realize that Japan has already proved that it is indeed sustainable for a long period of time. And I put this in to show that people talk a lot of shit, even if they're Fed presidents. Maybe even especially if they're Fed presidents. This chart from Grigor is United States employment in millions, 2001 to 2011. You can see how it went up and it went down, and it's struggling to get back up again. But it's really not getting there. So any great, huge plaudits for the Fed and anybody else who wants to be rewarded for that small increase is misplaced, I think. And note, Grigor, who I think probably lives in California because he always keeps this chart up to date, is the same thing but just for California. And as you can see, California isn't even struggling back up. It's falling still down. They're doing something wrong in California, but what is it? What's right, what's wrong, don't know. Krugman, this is Krugman, having his stab at QE2 and why it worked, and he thinks that it did in fact put the S&P, the Dow, up in value, and the extra value gave a mental impetus, a psychological impetus for people to go out and spend. But as he notes, the people with the main equity holdings are the rich people, so that's why the high-end spending has gone up, and that is the consumption spending that has added to the economy, not the low end. So the QE2 has helped the rich people to help the economy. This is from Tilt, part of the Financial Times outfit, and it's about Saudi Arabia, who we know have put in two huge budget reorganizations where they've agreed to spend huge amounts more money on the infrastructure and people of the country to keep them quiet. And this notes that but as the bank points out, despite US dollars gushing from the ground and massive reserves, the new spending plans come with risks of their own. The oil price needed to balance the 2011 Saudi budget is exceptionally high at about $80 a barrel, which is up twice as high as it was in 2006. And they note that break-even price could rise to $110 a barrel by 2015, the FT reports today, making the kingdom and its rulers politically dependent on record high prices. So what they're saying is don't expect the Saudi Arabia to come gushing forward with great amounts of oil to keep the price down, the world price down. And as we know, if anyone can get cheap oil out, it is Saudi Arabia. And so what they're going to do is get cheap oil out, but make sure that the oil price stays exceptionally high in the future, which is going to be a problem going forward for everybody, including the Federal Reserve, the central banks of the world, the governments of the world, the treasuries of the world, who have to somehow manipulate this into working out to keep the Western world afloat, which I think is becoming increasingly hard. That's it.